there is an additional problem, not a logical problem, but a problem with what the logic of utilitarian calculus tells us to do. We can call this a practical problem. Utilitarianism permits and even demands heinous or malignant actions for the sake of utility. As we saw in the trolley problem, you morally must pull the switch to save 5 people, meaning you morally must kill the one person. Think in terms of criterion 2, that moral theory should be consistent with our experience of the moral life, and the logical conclusions should reflect certain strong intuitions we have about what's ethical and how to treat others. It seems that some acts may be morally bad in themselves, or at least they should not or cannot be morally obligatory / required of us, like killing. As a result of criticisms of utilitarianism, the theory split into 2 kinds of utilitarianism: act and rule utilitarianism. Each focuses or emphasizes different features of utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is a form of utilitarianism that focuses on each specific individual act. So right actions are simply those that produce the most happiness and the least pain. The moral evaluation of a particular or current act is the scope of our focus. The evaluation of the act's moral status does not include any consideration for past or future similar actions. Mill is an act utilitarian in that he thinks the evaluation of an act's objective rightness or goodness always pertains to the particular act and does not include consideration for kinds of acts or consideration of kinds of acts. Act utilitarianism better reflects the particularity of moral situations. That rules are too general to tell us what to do here and now. And this hopefully reminds you of Aristotle's notion that ethics is inherently an imprecise subject matter, and that there are very real limits of what we can know ahead of time in order to help us through a moral situation. In general, act utilitarianism bites the bullet on the practical problem. In this moral framework, you may indeed be morally obliged or morally required to take actions you find abhorrent. And it lacks an easy solution to the logical problem, but it attempts to resolve it by limiting the scope of the evaluative outcomes. Or I guess I should put it this way, limiting the scope of outcomes which are included in the evaluation of a specific act, simply to immediate results and not to future possible results. Rule utilitarianism makes an effort to address both the logical problem and the practical problem. So in rule utilitarianism, right actions must conform to certain rules for action that tend to yield the most happiness and the least amount of pain. These are the rules that, if followed, will over time produce more happiness than if we only considered immediate consequences. Following the rules that tend to produce the greatest happiness is more likely to maximize happiness overall rather than making exceptions in certain circumstances, even if in an exceptional situation, breaking the rule would lead to greater happiness. So you ask yourself, would this act generally produce the most happiness, right? That's the answer. That's the question to answer. And if yes, if this act would generally produce the most happiness, then do that act. Then that's the right action to take in this case. So in rule utilitarianism, we approach the trolley problem by recognizing that, look, generally speaking, pulling a switch on a train to end somebody's life doesn't actually result in a net gain of happiness. That's not generally what this kind of action produces. And we could make it more abstract and just say that generally causing the death of someone doesn't produce a greater amount of happiness than not. And so in that case, because it is generally the case that this type of action doesn't in fact produce more happiness, even though in this case of the trolley problem it would, it still isn't the right action to do simply because this action doesn't generally tend to promote more happiness. So the standard for moral evaluation, consequences, remains. We still use that to evaluate the moral status of an action. But the action guiding mechanism is different. So instead of focusing on this action and the here and now consequences, rule utilitarianism uses the general tendencies of types of actions to produce happiness. Now's the time to reflect. So take about 10 minutes to respond to the following questions and then upload those responses on Blackboard to the journal entry titled February 23rd, Mill Utilitarianism Reflection Cues. 1. Thoughts on utilitarian calculus? Do you think utilitarianism is a good moral theory? If you think it fails in a meaningful way, how so? And does it still have some use? And if you think it is a good moral theory, tell me why. Question 2. Consider thought experiments like the trolley problem and this scenario with Alex and Pat. Are they useful? Do they help us think through moral problems? Or are they just wild scenarios? Write at least a paragraph discussing the uses of and differences between thought experiments and real life examples. What's on the exam? So here are the list of key terms that might end up on your midterm exam: consequentialism, utilitarianism, greatest happiness principle, the kinds and judges of pleasure, the trolley problem, and act and rule utilitarianism.